Love Does by Bob Goff. Chapter 2, titled Sniper Fire. Subtitled, I used to think I had to act a certain way to follow God, but now I know God doesn't want us to be typical. I heard about Jesus for the first time when I was in high school from a guy named Doug, who I used to shoot BB guns with. We would go out in the woods by a reservoir and shoot at cans and old car fenders. Neither of us was a very good shot, and we rarely hit what we aimed for, so we just called whatever we hit the target. There are a lot of people who still do that. Being in the woods and armed makes a 15-year-old feel like he has chest hair. The prospect of losing an eye also kept us coming back. It's not necessarily a guy thing. Well, actually, yes, it's a guy thing. One day, Doug's BB gun broke and he got a pellet gun. I wanted to have a pellet gun too, but I couldn't find someone to hook me up with one, so I kept using my old gun I got when I was 8 years old. There was a big difference between Doug's legit pellet gun and my crummy BB gun. My gun didn't shoot very far or very well. After it was cocked once, it could almost shoot across the room. That is, unless a fan was on, then only about half that distance. It did have a slot where you could put a couple of drops of oil that would turn into a little puff of blue smoke when you pulled the trigger. Despite this fun little feature, mine was no match for Doug's gun, and we both knew it. Doug's pellet gun shot like a real gun too. He could pump it up what seemed like an unlimited number of times, and we imagined it could pierce steel. He put a huge scope on the barrel and then put camouflage on the gun, mostly made of old socks painted green and some weeds. It was an awesome piece of firepower compared to my Daisy BB gun, even though mine had blue smoke and his didn't. I thought I'd save up for a pellet gun like Doug's and maybe a rifle rack too. Yes, definitely a rifle rack. One lazy afternoon, Doug and I were walking side by side along a trail in the woods. I was looking for new cans to shoot or ones to finish off we'd only wounded the week before. Suddenly I noticed Doug wasn't at my side any longer. I looked to the left and right, but Doug was nowhere to be found. When I looked back behind me, however, I saw the muzzle of Doug's pellet gun pointing at me from behind a tree, half a green sock hanging from the scope, which was up to his eye. I had become the next tin can, and I did what any hardened gunslinger would do. I ran. As I ran, I cocked my Daisy BB gun with the blue smoke, and just over the rise in the hill, I turned to defend myself. But before I could get a round off, Doug pulled his trigger and shot me right in the belly. Doug must have pumped up his gun 20 times or more, because I fell to my knees, looked down, and there was a hole and some blood where the pellet went through my shirt and inside of me. We were both pretty surprised and wonderfully amazed at the same time. We had just become one of those stories you hear about. Doug prayed for me and told me not to walk toward the light. I told Doug he could have my bicycle if I didn't make it. We put gum and leaves over the hole to stop the bleeding and made our way back to Doug's bedroom to get some tweezers and get the pellet out. We splashed some scope mouthwash on the hole to clean it, then dug in with tweezers and got the pellet. He awarded me a Purple Heart. I gave him a sniper medal, and we vowed to go back and shoot at each other as often as we could. I liked how Doug did life. He was full of adventure and always had some wonderful mischief in mind. Sitting on the edge of Doug's bed laughing about the day, Doug began telling me the story about another man of adventure named Jesus, who lived a long time ago. Like Doug, Jesus wasn't a religious guy. To me, Jesus sounded like an ordinary guy who was utterly amazing. He helped people. He figured out what they really needed and tried to point them toward that. He healed people who were hurting. He spent time with the kinds of people most of us spend our lives avoiding. It didn't seem to matter to Jesus who these people were because he was all about engagement. That's one of the things I saw in Doug. I liked that Doug could be friends with Jesus and still shoot pellet guns. I didn't think that was allowed, but apparently it was. I don't have one of the harrowing stories you sometimes hear when someone describes his initial encounter with Jesus. I wasn't on drugs, I hadn't committed any felonies, and I hadn't been in jail. I hadn't had much exposure to religion, and what I did know, I didn't particularly understand. There was something about communion and something about Sunday school, and whatever the question was, Jesus was supposed to be the answer. There was also something about studying the Bible with a bunch of guys on Wednesdays, which sounded weird because I thought you were supposed to read it and do what it said, not just study it. Maybe there was a workbook that went with it. All I knew of faith were fragments and shards of various traditions, but I hadn't ever heard the whole story about who Jesus was and what he wanted the world to know about him. Despite my lack of prior knowledge, when my sniper friend Doug told me the whole story, it made a lot of sense. I think it was more about what I saw in Doug than what he had to say to me. In fact, until we were in his room in post-op, we hadn't talked about Jesus much at all. Still, I knew Doug had something I wanted. I never wanted religion. I didn't understand it and didn't particularly want to either. To be honest, I thought being religious was for wimpy guys who didn't get into mischief. Though Doug wasn't a good shot, or he was a great one, depending on how you look at it, he wasn't a wimp, and he seemed to know a person, a real, living God who liked him and even loved him even though Doug was as screwed up as I was. Because of Doug, I believed in this God. I wanted to know him too. I believed that Jesus wasn't just so much blue smoke to make religion seem like the real thing. He was the real thing, and he had a lot of firepower. I'm in my 50s now, and I don't run around in the woods playing with BB guns. That's way too tame. I have a playful spirit, but I'm also a lawyer and have ties and suit jackets in the same closet that holds my now rusty BB gun. At times I'm struck by how strange it is that the same person who has gone through so many life changes over the years can believe in this God who is still the same because he never changes. And it's even stranger because I have a legal mind and I spend my time proving things for a living. It's very hard to prove God, yet I still go on believing. I have an overwhelming sense of gratitude as I get older because I can see, both through the good times and the bad times, that God has been with me. Because I'm a lawyer and a follower of Jesus, I'm occasionally asked by people about my religion. I'm not always sure what they hope to learn from me, and the first thing I tell them is that they probably shouldn't be talking to me. I don't validate my faith with a church attendance scorecard. I think of church as a vibrant community of people consisting of two or more varied backgrounds gathering around Jesus. Sometimes they are at a place that might have a steeple or auditorium seating, but it's just as likely that church happens elsewhere, like coffee shops, or on the edge of a glacier, or in the bush in Uganda. All of these places work just fine, I suppose. When it's a matter of the heart, the place doesn't matter. For me, it's Jesus plus nothing, not even a building. When my friends ask about my faith, I tell them that a long time ago, my friend Doug told me about Jesus and said I could know him. I didn't start believing in Jesus just because Doug had shot me, but I've never stopped believing in him even though I've caught some sniper fire from some religious people since then. There's a passage in the Bible that says people who haven't met Jesus are going to think the people who have met Jesus are crazy. I get that look sometimes, and it's usually from people who don't have a lot of creativity, or haven't experienced whimsy, or haven't played with BB guns, or been shot once or twice. The people who slowly became typical have the greatest problem wrapping their minds around a dynamic friendship with an invisible, alive God. There's nothing wrong with being typical, I guess, but there's nothing fundamentally right about it either. I've never read in Genesis that God created typical and called it good. Instead, I think men who were bored made up typical and called it, if not good, at least acceptable. People who follow Jesus, though, are no longer typical. God is constantly inviting them into a life that moves away from typical. Even if they have normal jobs, live in a normal houses, and drive normal cars, they're just not the same anymore. The ones Jesus first picked to follow him started out typical, to be sure. They were unschooled and ordinary fishermen, business people, blind people, loose women, rip-offs, and vagrants. They were people who were lousy shots like me and Doug, folks who had been injured in life and patched together with gum and leaves and grace. But like my BB gun, what Christ followers lack in velocity, they make up for in intensity. They are people who have experienced an intensely intimate friendship with Jesus and have moved forward with an intensity to parallel that experience. Jesus lets us be real with our life and our faith. Maybe my BB gun doesn't shoot as far as the next guy's. That used to matter to me, but it doesn't matter to me anymore. What Jesus said we could do is leave typical behind. We could leave all the comparisons and all of the trappings and all of the pretending of religion. Jesus told the people he was with that it's not enough to just look like you love God. He said we'd know the extent of our love for God by how well we loved people. Doug and I are still friends. I send him text messages once in a while to see how he's doing and to find out if he shot anyone lately. I'm not that great at spelling, and thankfully my phone autocorrects the words I type for me. What I've noticed, though, is that almost every time I type in the word love, it gets changed to the word live. It's kind of a reminder to me of one of the things I learned from Doug about following Jesus. I learned that fully loving and fully living are not only synonymous, but the kind of life that Jesus invited us to be part of. And because of that, our lives don't need to be just puffs of blue smoke anymore.